Hello, welcome to this short lecture on class. And previously, we stopped at an example where we create a class called person, and this person has several attributes as well as a method. So let's look at the class that we have discussed before this. So here I have a person.hpp um, a file, and notice here that this is the class that we have created in our lecture class, and it has a name and an age. And this is the constructor for the class, which we have three in this case: the default constructor, the overloaded constructor, which accepts a name and the age, as well as another constructor which accepts an age. And then we have some other methods to get the attributes, name and age, as well as the other methods that sets the name and age. Now there's one additional function here which I just added for the purpose of this class, which is a function called show, and the purpose of this is to show the details of a person. So let's look at the definition of this class. So you can see from here that this class has several functions which is defined in this file person.cpp. And so for the show function that I mentioned just now, it actually shows the name and the age just with a simple cout. So the rest are just purely basic, and you shouldn't find this difficult to understand. Now here we are going to move on to a source file called array-person.cpp, and what we're trying to do here is trying to show you how to create arrays of and instances of person, right? So let's begin. So let's try to use the array to store the person object, right? Array of person. Okay, let's call this array of person, and here's how it looks like. So suppose I have a variable name called persons, and I want to create an array that stores 3 person, let's say. So what I can do is I can create an integer which is a constant, and I set the size to 3, and I put the size in the square bracket of this C++ statement. So it's pretty easy. So the way to read this is to say that a persons is a variable that stores 3 objects of person class. So when you actually write like this, what happens? Well, actually it will call the default constructors and initialize each person object using the default constructor. So to see the output, let us write a code that goes like this. For integer I equals 0, I less than size, plus I. And if you try to call the persons dot I dot show. So remember we have the show function that we can call. So when we call this show function for the ith person, and we do that for every person that we have in array, then you should see that it actually initializes the person using the default constructor. So for that, let us try to compile this code. Alright, so now if you can see from here, if I try to compile this code, and since this is a multi-file program, we have to compile not just this source file, but also we have to compile the source file for the class definition of the person class. So when you compile and you run, you see that for all of the person in the array, the name is unknown and the age is 0, which corresponds to what we do when we write the default constructor, which is to set the name to unknown and age to 0. Right? So what does it tell you? This tells you that when you create this array, it will by default call the default constructor and initialize each of the elements in the array with we actually call the default constructor to initializes every element in the array. So suppose let's say you do not want this to happen. Suppose you want that different element is being initialized with different constructor. So how do you do it? So let's say I give you a scenario, right? So suppose, let's say I want to initialize. Okay, let's say you want to initialize persons 0 using default constructor. So this is the same as before. So let's say I want the person 0 to be initializing default constructor, while persons 1 is initialized using the overloaded constructor that looks like this: person string n and integer a. So suppose, let's say I want to use this to initialize the persons 1, and let's say persons 2, I want to use this constructor that just takes an age. So how do I do this? Well, you can write it like this. So I can say person 0 is equals to so for this one I can still call the constructor like this, so that this person 0 will be initialized using the default constructor. As for the second one, which is person 1, you can initialize using another constructor. And suppose, let's say I want to initialize the name to, let's say, um, Tony Stark, and the age to be say 50. Then this is how you use the overloaded constructor that accepts two parameters to initialize your person object. So let's say you do it for the last one, which is person 2. Then you can use, for example, let's say I want to set the age to, let's say, 100. Then you can do it like this. So when you run the loop and show the details of each person, you should see that they use a different constructor. So now let's have a look at it. So now I'm combine program, and you can see that they are initialized using a different constructor, and everything is good. Okay, so this is an example that uses array, right? So let's look at another example, and we try to do the same thing using vectors, right? So now let me open another file to sort of start over, and here I have a file called vector-person.cpp. So now I'm going to use a vector instead, right? So here we start off with a new source file, and then we include the persons.hpp so that we can use the person class. Now, in order for me to use the vector, I need to include the vector class. So now here I can use the vector. So to create a vector of person, what we do is we say that vector person is persons, and what I can do now is that so you can see this vector here, it actually does not allocate any memory for storing the objects yet. So in this case, if you want to add new persons objects into the vector, we have to use the pushback function. So what we do is, so let's say again, I want to do something like what we did before, which is I want to initialize this way. So what you can do is that we can write like this: persons dot pushback. So how do you push back a new object? Well, you can just call the constructor straight away, and this one is using the default constructor. And because this is the first pushback to the vector, so this will be this object will be stored for at location 0. Do the same thing for the second one, and that's going to be push back person, and we put a Tony Stark followed by, say, 50 years old. And then this is going to be a third one, which is person of push underscore back. Then we can push another object. In this case, we just pass in age, say 100. Okay, so that will initialize them accordingly. Now, let's say if I were to write a loop to access the attributes of a person's, I can write the loop like this: for integer I equals to 0, I less than person's dot size, then I do I plus I. Here, what I can do is I write person's square bracket I dot show, right? So there you have it. Now let's look at the example. After compiling the code, so vector person dot cpp followed by the person cpp class, and when you compile and run it, you get exactly the same output as what you expect, and same as what we get from the array person dot cpp class, right? Okay, that actually is really everything that you need to know about how do you create an array of persons or even a vector of persons. So in the next video, I'll show you an example that will combine everything together, in which we'll talk about an example of how to create a poker card, and we're going to create an array of poker cards that will initialize automatically. So I'll see you in the next video for the next discussion. Right, thank you very much.